Okay, folks, so as I mentioned, we're looking at the last part tonight on the philosophy section. So we've got a whole lot of isms to go through. These ones I think will be a bit more familiar than some of the previous ones. So we're going to start with socialism. So firstly, Marxism is a political philosophy that was developed by Karl Marx, who was a Prussian Jewish philosopher. Can't really call him German in the sense we use today, because Germany didn't exist then, if you know your history. But Prussia did. And in the 19th century, he had this political philosophy that he developed that focused on class struggle. And the idea was that the ruling classes in nations would be oppressing the lower classes, and we needed social revolution in order to create a classless, homogeneous society. In other words, a society where everyone is equal. And he argued that the driving factor behind all human history is economics. So he differed there from a lot of philosophers. And because it's by labor that man survives, he said that we get our identity from our work, and that economic systems totally control a person, and that human communities are created by the division of labor. And he concluded that because historically society had been based on agriculture for centuries until the Industrial Revolution. Remember, with the Industrial Revolution, things changed, and all of a sudden you had factories and people working for these capitalists, as he would call them. And now, instead of working for themselves, many people were working in factories, and he felt that that stripped away their dignity and their identity, and they were reduced to mere slaves who were controlled by this powerful taskmaster. And because of this view, obviously it made the capitalist or the industrialist the natural enemy of his system. And he said that there were two separate communities. There were the business owners, who he called the bourgeoisie, and the working class, who he termed the proletariat. According to him, again, the bourgeoisie would exploit the proletariat, and the result was that one person's gain is another person's loss. So the bourgeoisie were getting filthy rich, and the working class were being exploited. And once again, these are all his suppositions. Business owners influence the lawmakers to ensure that their interests are defended over the workers' loss of rights. And then infamously, he also said that religion is the opiate of the masses. Remember, opiates, opium, basically a drug. And he felt that religion was just used by the rich to manipulate the proletariat. And it was just a tool to make the working class sort of be pacified, because you promised them reward in heaven if they kind of just behaved themselves and worked hard, where God had placed them subservient to the bourgeoisie. And so it was just a tool to oppress the masses, in his view. Hence why communism is so anti-religion. Some people wonder why it is. And capitalism emphasizes private property. So he said that that reduced ownership to the privileged few, and that the best system of government is one where there's no private ownership of property, and where you have communal ownership, or rather the state owning everything that's needed for economic production. So land belongs to the state, the factories, and the businesses belong to the state. And wealth is distributed equally, or apparently, and each citizen gives selflessly to the collective. And this wall that capitalism had supposedly constructed between the owners and the working class would then be broken. A person's identity would be elevated, and you'd have a classless society. Everyone would respect one another and work together for a common purpose. That's how the theory went. And the goal was to have a government-run utopia, like heaven on earth, in which the needs of each individual are always provided for. So you don't have any poor people. You don't have rich, you don't have poor. And ideally, the strong work hard, the inventive create technological marvels, the doctors heal, the artists delight the community with beauty, and anyone who is weak or poor or in need can draw on society's combined resources as their needs demand. You get three types, well, obviously there might be others, but mainly you get three types of economic systems used by governments today. So one is socialism, which emphasizes equal distribution of wealth among the people. Communism is an extreme form of socialism. And then capitalism, people work for their own wealth. Just to talk about factors of production, that's what you need in order to produce goods or service. So what do you need in order to make, products? In a business, you need land, you need labor, and you need capital. And in a capitalist economy, those items are owned by individuals. In a communist economy, it's owned by the government. Obviously, in a capitalist system, you get some state-owned property as well. We can see in our own country, if you compare the state-run, enterprises compared to private enterprises, just the difference. You almost get a preview of capitalism versus communism just in that sense when you look at the difference between, how well things like Eskom and Telkom and SAA and SOBC are doing compared to private businesses. And so in a capitalist economy, your production and your prices are determined by free market forces. They're not determined by the government. You might sometimes have some sort of government regulation, but generally, how much you produce and your prices are determined, as you can see by that little diagram there, by supply and demand, individual choice and competition. So that kind of explains capitalism in a nutshell there. In a communist economy, the government control the prices and they determine which goods and services get produced. And so here's a little diagram to explain how it works in communism. Okay, and hopefully that, how prices and goods are produced and determined. Now, typically, we are aware that with communism there's a lot else besides the economics, and it's probably some of these other things that it's notorious for. In terms of a political system, you find in the modern world capitalism is associated with democracy. You have multiple political parties, you have free elections. In communism, it's a totalitarian state. In other words, it's one-party state. As the joke goes, you only vote once for communism. In terms of personal liberties, you'll find that in capitalist societies, it's associated with freedom of speech, a free press, and freedom of religion. Once again, and there's necessarily, you could question, well, why should it be? Well, it just is that way. Communism is supposed to be about economics, and yet in communist societies you have strong censorship and you have religious persecution. Goes without saying. Look at the remaining communist countries like North Korea and China, although China is getting more and more capitalist, and you look at how the USSR was during the days of the Cold War, and that's what you had: religious persecution, no free speech. So there's a couple of errors in Marxist thinking. The first is that one person's gain is another's loss. It's a sort of mindset that in order to get something, you have to take it from somewhere else. We even see it in our own country. Rather than creating something or being inventive, just take something that belongs to someone else rather. In a proper capitalist society, it's not the case that one's gain is another's loss. You can actually create things. And so his assertion that one person's gain has to come at someone else's expense is a myth. The structure of capitalism leaves plenty of room for all to raise their standard of living through innovation and competition. And so it's perfectly feasible for multiple parties to compete and to do well in a market of consumers who want their goods and services, so the market can actually grow. It doesn't have to be that because one person is doing well, everybody else is suffering. It can just be that the economy grows, and you see this very much so. There's a reason why the United States is by far the wealthiest country in the world. I mean, the United States, the turnover of New York City is more than our entire country, and that's one city. Then the idea that value is based solely on labor hours is also a fallacy. The quality of goods or services can't just be determined by how many hours you put into it, because a master carpenter can more quickly and beautifully make a piece of furniture than an unskilled craftsman can. And obviously the price is determined on that. If something's made by someone who's skilled, not only will it be better workmanship, it would have taken less time to do. And so what you pay for it is not just based on how long it took, you're also paying for the skill that goes into it, not just the time. Marx, visualizes some sort of a utopia where government is free from corruption and there's no elitism within its ranks. If you have read the story, the Animal Farm by George Orwell, which is a parody on communism, very good, I must say, where the animals get fed up with the farmer who treats them badly and take over the farm. But ultimately, the animals who are in charge end up, becoming like the farmer. And, they start off with the slogan that all animals are equal. And then ultimately it gets changed to all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And that's typically what you see in communist countries, hence why the book was banned in communist countries. And so in reality, we've seen communism fail because people are generally corrupt. And we have a failed oppressive autocratic states worldwide because history has demonstrated that power corrupts fallen man and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so a nation or a government may kill the idea of God, but someone will take God's place. And that someone is most often an individual or a group who begins to rule over the population, like we see in North Korea, and seeks to maintain their privileged position at all costs. And it's a case with all the communist systems. Then, religion, the opiate of the masses. So the idea is religion is just a tool, as I said, to control the poor. It's a tool that the rich use. That's a fallacy. It disregards history. You just have to look in the Old Testament. The second book in the Old Testament shows how religious leader Moses freed his people from tyranny and slavery. And so their religion came from the poor, and it was to break free of tyranny, not to, the Egyptians were, using and abusing the Israelites, and it was God who delivered them from, the abusive situation. And many of the judges, if you read the book of Judges, liberated the people from oppression, from foreign tyranny. It was quite common. They'd be oppressed by tyrants, and the judges who were religious leaders, liberated them. They didn't use it as a tool to enslave them. And Christianity began among the poor working class in the Roman Empire, if you know your history. For the first couple of centuries, it was only in the 4th century that it became fashionable to be a Christian. The first 3 centuries, they were routinely thrown to the lions, and they were persecuted by the rich ruling class. So Marx, clearly, as clever as he might have been, didn't know his history. And we see even today that religion remains in communist societies despite the fact that there's active persecution by the ruling authorities. So why would it remain if its supposed sole function has been removed? So he's saying religion's there for the rich to pacify the poor who they're oppressing. So how is it that in communist societies where you no longer have that problem, you still have religion and people who are prepared to die so they can continue religion. Why would they want to do that when they're supposedly basking in the benefits of communism? Another fallacy is that workers are more divided. Are divided by more than their work. He felt that, his call would go out to all the workers, because in the Communist Manifesto that he co-authored with Friedrich Engels, he had the saying, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." That's the popular slogan, and it wasn't exactly that in the book. He felt that all the workers would want to unite because the common enemy was the boss who was oppressing them. The reality is that there are many other things that divide workers. They're divided by race, religion, culture. A person's identity is not solely bound up in their work. That's what he assumed, and he was wrong. And although secular society tries to force that belief on people, the Bible says that all have equal worth because we're created in the image of the eternal God. And that's where our true intrinsic value lies, not in what work we do. Big problem is obviously that there's no ethical foundation in communism. And the forced attempts at the removal of religion exacerbates that situation. So there's no command in communism, "Thou shalt not kill." And so communism has been the cause of the death of millions because of people like Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, and Kim Jong-un. In their attempts to enforce this system, there's no ethics. And so they'll do anything, and human life is cheap, and the state is considered more important than the individual. So if to kill a couple of thousand or millions like Stalin or Mao Zedong did to sort of get your system working, so be it. And then finally, does economics drive history, as Marx said? Is economic the catalyst that drives entire human history? Well, the Bible tells us that God controls human history, ultimately is sovereign. We realize there's other forces at play, and Satan and the divine council and political leaders on the earth, but ultimately it's God who is sovereign. And in Daniel 4 verse 17, this is all to do with Nebuchadnezzar, who thought he was the guy who was running the world because of the Babylonian Empire, and he had to be humbled and realized that ultimately he was really, there were forces at play that were far greater than him. And it says the sentence, that was what was going to happen to him, where he'd be humiliated, even though he was proud, is by the decree of the watchers, so that's obviously the divine council, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives it to whom he will, and sets it over the lowliest of men. So Nebuchadnezzar had to learn that lesson. Then who empowers us to work? Is it simply the government? Well, God empowers a person to be healthy. He gave you your intelligence to, be able to learn a skill and be good at your job and to benefit and enjoy the wealth that comes from it. That's what it says in Deuteronomy 8 verse 18. Remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms His covenant. So yes, we might think, well, I produced this wealth and I can do with it what I want. The reality is, ultimately, whatever you did was just by the grace of God. He, as I say, gave you the health and the skills to do it. Ecclesiastes 5 verse 18 to 19. Behold, what I've seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one finds toil under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. So Solomon's saying it's good to enjoy your work, but he says everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God. So even our ability to labor is really a gift from God. So moving on to feminism, another one that should be fairly familiar. It consists of a range of political movements and ideologies. The basic goal is to establish and achieve political and economic, personal and social equality of the sexes. So it seeks to establish educational and professional opportunities for women that are equal to those of men. And so feminist movements have campaigned to get women the right to vote, to hold public office, to work, to earn fair wages or equal pay, to own property. A lot of these might just seem like no-brainers to us, but you go 100 years or more back, you have a situation where, women couldn't vote, and, there was a lot of jobs that we denied them. Receive education, to enter contracts, to have equal rights within marriage, and to have maternity leave. Now, a lot of those things aren't bad, so we mustn't just think, all of this is terrible, because a lot of good was brought about. There were a lot of ills that did need to be corrected. And so feminists, especially the earlier ones, have worked to protect women and girls from rape, sexual harassment, and domestic violence. Changes in dress and acceptable physical activity have often been part of feminist movements. That may or may not be good. And particularly in the West, feminists are generally considered to have been the main force behind changes that have brought about increased women's rights. And as I mentioned, the fact that women can now vote, and the right to enter into contracts, own property, and for promoting gender neutrality. That's the idea that policies, language, and other social institutions should avoid distinguishing roles according to a person's gender. But the problem as Christians would really be what we could call toxic feminism, where there's been this shift from equality of women to superiority. And there are obviously some downsides to that. So it initially began as a challenge to male domination and female subordination. And it could have been a champion of equality. But you find that today feminism is not liberation from sexism, but it's really often anti-male sexism. You get the opposite. As we often see in societies that were racist, they swing over to another extreme where you just get reverse racism. And so the state today is that, males have been demonized and vilified, and they can't do anything right. And the strategy becomes to raise female by lowering men and convincing people that women are good and men are bad. And that obviously is against Christian values. The other hot point is abortion, or reproductive rights, supposedly, where that was driven very much by feminist movements, but not so in the early movement. The early leaders of the feminist movement were against abortion. The radical feminist Susan B. Anthony referred to abortion as child murder and viewed it as a means of exploiting both women and children. And be aware that there are some feminists who still oppose abortion on these and other grounds, but there are feminists who advocate what they call reproductive rights, which includes access to contraceptives and to abortion. But the Bible, as we know, teaches that life begins in the womb. Psalm 139, verse 13, David says to God, "You formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb." We even see from the account of John the Baptist in the womb of Elizabeth, he could recognize that Jesus was the Messiah, even while he was in his mother's womb. And the death of a child while still in the womb constituted murder in the Bible. In fact, in a lot of societies, and this is the irony today, if you were to hit a woman in her stomach and cause the death of the infant, it's considered murder. And in the book of Exodus, it says that if people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, if there's serious injury, you to take life for life. Now, the irony is that you do have cases today where that is still held, and yet they allow abortion. So the mother can murder the child, just no one else can. LGBT is another one that you should be familiar with, and the acronym, well, not really an acronym, it's an initialism. There's a difference. It seems to get longer every time you look at it. And so since the 1990s, it was adapted to replace the term gay, and it stood for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. It was initially LGB, and now it's grown to LGBTQ, and some add I's, and it just gets longer and longer to the point of being ridiculous. A popular variant adds the letter Q for those who identify as queer, who's questioning their sexual identity since 1996. And those who add intersex people to the group will add an I in. And as I say, without getting into it, it's just bizarre. The Bible condemns homosexuality as sinful behavior. Leviticus 18 verse 22, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. There's some people who claim to be Christians and practicing homosexuality, and they say that the Bible doesn't speak out against it. Or if it does, it's only in the Old Testament, not the New Testament. Well, I'm not too sure what you do with verses like that. Leviticus 20:13, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, it's quite explicit what's happening there. Both of them have committed an abomination. And the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 6 verse 9 to 10, do not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality, and a whole lot of others as well, will inherit the kingdom of God. 1 Timothy 1 9 to 10, the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. Now, homosexuality is a sin that's against nature, because one of the purposes for marriage is procreation. I think most people realize that in order for procreation within humans, you need opposite gender. And that's why same-sex relationships cannot naturally procreate. It's against nature. And that's what it says in Romans 1. It says, for this reason, and that's because people chose to ignore the plain knowledge of God, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. So, there are people who try to argue about what words may or may not mean. Well, yeah, you'll find, as in Leviticus, it's not just single words. Paul's describing in great detail the sin that he's addressing there. Now, at the same time, we've got to realize that the Bible doesn't consider homosexuality a greater sin than others. In fact, I would argue that we've probably got a bigger problem in the church with adultery than we have with homosexuality. And adultery is also offensive to God, as is any sin. Okay, you can be a swindler, just because someone sins differently to you doesn't mean that, your sin is less offensive to God. And so the LGBT agenda is unbiblical, but we do need to bear in mind that the Bible makes it clear that the jurisdiction for judging those outside the church doesn't belong to us, it belongs to God. And so Paul writes to them and tells them to take action against the sexually immoral man, but he was a man who was in fellowship with them. And so he says here, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the people of the world, this world who are immoral, or the greedy and swindlers, or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave this world. But now I'm writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater, a slanderer, drunkard, swindler. See, it's not just homosexuality. It says, do not even eat with such people. What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. So our jurisdiction for judging is inside the church. So we're within our rights when we have a constitution whereby we say that we will not take into membership people who live in that lifestyle. You know, they're welcome to fellowship with us because any sinners can fellowship with us in the same way that Jesus didn't endorse prostitution and he didn't endorse theft, and yet he was the friend of the prostitute and the tax collector who were sexually immoral and thieves. The fact that he was the friend of the sinner didn't mean that he endorsed their sin, and we should be the same. We mustn't discriminate this is in the workplace, against anyone in terms of legal rights, employment, protection, and delivery of services. However, and this is obviously a thorny point, things like marriage and associated benefits like raising children is for man and woman only. And this is the thing, is that obviously the LGBT agenda has got to the point where they want to have these associated benefits and to have their union termed a marriage, which it is not. Historically, and certainly from the Judeo-Christian point of view, Jesus said, and he was quoting the book of Genesis, haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female? Okay, not a whole lot of other genders, not male and male or female and female, made them male and female. And he's speaking about this in the context of marriage. And said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, that's a woman, and the two will become one flesh. Okay, so the Christian viewpoint is that marriage is between a male and a female. It always has been. Transgenders claim they can be any sex they choose to be because that's what they believe they are, which is ridiculous, really. If someone says, I believe I'm a chicken, you wouldn't, say, well, they're legally a chicken. In fact, we would dismiss that as laughable. And this is the kind of ridiculous stuff we're actually getting into. Stuff that, even in our lifetime, we would have thought laughable. Well, it is still laughable. Gender cannot be determined by believing you are what you want to be, even if you have a sex change. Sex changes don't change people into a different sex. The Weizmann Institute of Science researchers have identified 6,500 genes that are expressly different in men and women. For example, they found genes that were highly expressed in the skin of men relative to that in women's skin. These were related to the growth of body hair. Gene expression for muscle building was higher in men, that for fat storage was higher in women, etc., etc. 6,500. So you can go change and either chop off or add, appendages and have implants and all this sort of thing. The fact is, genetically, you still are what you were born, a man or a woman, and it's determined by your genetic makeup, not by what clothes you put on or how you've tried to make yourself appear. Moving on to modernism versus postmodernism. Now, in order to understand the term postmodern, you first got to define modernism, and just bear in mind that these terms often mean different things depending on the field you're looking at. They sometimes apply to the field of art and music and whatever. Obviously, in our context, we're talking from a philosophic point of view. And so modernism refers to neoclassical Enlightenment assumptions concerning the role that reason, rationality, or scientific reasoning play in guiding our understanding of the human condition, and in extreme cases of postmodern theory, nature itself. Now, postmodernism challenges those basic assumptions. I'm just going to go through this table that was outlaid in your book. Describes it pretty well, and you'll basically see on the left-hand side modernism and on the right-hand side postmodernism. So in modernism, reason and science provide accurate, objective, reliable foundation of knowledge. It sounds pretty good to me. But in postmodernism, reason and science are ideologies in the Nietzscheism or Marxist sense, simply myths created by man. Modernism says that reason transcends and exists independently of our existential, historical, cultural context. It is universal and true. Postmodernism says there is no universal objective means of judging any given concept as true. All judgments of truth exist within a cultural context, cultural relativism. Modernism, because it is universal, reason can help us overcome all conflicts. Postmodernism, nope. Science is no more universal than is any other culture's definition of truth. Basically, what you can see is on the left-hand column, things that make sense. And on the right-hand column, basically the response you might expect from an idiot. Because you get nonsense, really. Modernism says science is the paradigm of all true knowledge. Postmodernism challenges that. Modernism says that reason and human independence and freedom are inherently linked. Just laws conform to the dictates of reason. We hold these truths to be self-evident. But postmodernism will challenge that and says the application of pure reason disproves the universal nature of a priori, that means you had it before, human freedom. Independence, freedom are Western ideologies, just like reason and science, used to colonize foreign cultures or subjugate women. Modernism says language is transparent, a one-to-one relationship between signifier, word, and signified, a thing or concept. But in postmodernism, language is fluid, that means it can change, it's arbitrary, it's rooted in power and knowledge relations, meaning is fluid and arbitrary, meaning is messy. As I say, the right-hand side, nonsense. Modernism says that reason will lead to universal truths all cultures will embrace. Postmodernism says there are no external truths. There's no universal human experience, no universal human rights, overriding narrative of human progress. So in summary, modernism says that truth exists independent of human consciousness and can be known through the application of reason. All Enlightenment conclusions lead from this assumption. Postmodernism says truth may exist independent of human consciousness, but there's no objective means of nailing it down. All postmodern conclusions lead from this assumption. Modernism says the existence of stable, coherent self independent of culture and society. Postmodernism, self is a myth and largely a composite of one's social experiences and cultural context. The self is an ideology. Okay, and I think this is the final one. Modernism, the connotations, is the application of reason leads to progressive movement towards civilization, democracy, freedom, and scientific advancement. The Enlightenment is prescriptive, a means of building a better society. Postmodernism, there is no objective means upon which to predicate morality and right, just governance. Postmodern theory is descriptive of the human condition. It describes an impasse in philosophy and social relations. And in modernism, the modernist feminist would have said that women are oppressed by patriarchy and can use reason to achieve both independence and regain their authentic selves. Postmodern feminism, once again, is just bizarre. The categories male, female, masculine, feminine are themselves culturally constructed and/or are ideological. Gender roles are culturally relative in all cultures and contexts. I want to tell you that the response to that within evangelical Christianity is not uniform, amazingly enough. It ranges from those, like myself, who are convinced that it's no friend of the gospel, considering, remember our friend epistemology, that's knowledge, it's epistemological bankruptcy. Its tendency towards nihilism. Okay, nihilism, just to qualify that, it's the belief that all values are baseless and that nothing can be known or communicated. And because of its moral relativism, very different to what the Bible teaches. And to those who agree essentially with its critique of the Enlightenment, so there are some Christians who agree with it, amazingly enough. Whether they're Christians in the sense you and I would define Christians is another question altogether. Also representative of the strong stance are leaders of the emerging church movement. That's those who advocate this kind of thing, who seek to do church in a way that resonates with the postmodern temper. So when you hear about the emerging church, it's typically people who identify with this bizarre postmodernism. And all I can think of when I read that right column on that table is Romans 1:22, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Because that's really, what they are. They're trying to be clever and really just sound like idiots. Job 13 verse 5 says, "Oh, that you would be completely silent, and that it would become your wisdom." And that would be my advice to them as well. Because the Bible tells us that even a fool is thought wise if he keeps his mouth closed. Proverbs 13:20, "He who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm." So it's certainly not anything we want anything to do with, in my opinion. Proverbs 14 verse 12, "There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death." It's not relative. There's a right way and there's a wrong way. Ephesians 5 verse 6 says, "Let no one deceive you with empty words," which really what postmodernism is. "For because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience." Jeremiah 10 verse 23, "I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself, that it is not in man who walks to direct his steps." The Bible talks about ultimate truth, and that truth being known by an omnipotent God, and truth is not relative in the mind of the person. Okay, moving on to the New Age movement. Now, the New Age movement is something that's difficult to define because it means different things to different people, and unfortunately it's become a term that's been used far too loosely. And so it's applied to a range of spiritual beliefs that developed in Western countries during the 1970s. Wikipedia admits that it's difficult to define precisely, but these are kind of the overall principles it gives that you can apply to the phenomenon we call the New Age movement. Theologically, the New Age typically adopts a belief in a holistic form of divinity that imbues all of the universe, including human beings themselves. There is thus a strong emphasis on the spiritual authority of the self. It's important. This is accompanied by a common belief in a wide variety of semi-divine, non-human entities. such as angels and masters, with whom humans can communicate, particularly through the form of channeling. So you'll find a little bit of the occult thrown in here, a little bit of Eastern religion, a little bit of pantheism. Typically viewing human history as being divided into a series of distinct ages. This is a common New Age belief, where they hold that man was previously once much more enlightened in a former age in terms of both technological advancement and spiritual wisdom, and that we've actually entered a period of spiritual degeneracy, which normally they'll blame on things like Christianity. But they look to a coming age of Aquarius. According to them, we're in the age of Pisces now, and in the age of Aquarius, which will probably coincide anyway with the coming of Antichrist, and the New Ages will be happy as well, besides all the other religions who are looking for their own personal messiahs. And there's a strong focus on healing, particularly using forms of alternative medicine, and an emphasis on New Age science that seeks to unite science and spirituality. Now, I mentioned this in one of my books, is that often the term New Age is too broad to be of meaningful use, because it's become a bit of a dumping ground for a plethora of beliefs that are just sort of vaguely similar. Wouter Hanegraaff, who's a professor of history of Hermetic philosophy and related currents at the University of Amsterdam, said that New Age was a label attached indiscriminately to whatever seems to fit it, and as such it means very different things to different people. Scholars disagree as to its scope. Some, like Stephen J. Sutcliffe and Ingvild Silent-Gillis, suggesting that it remains among the most disputed of categories in the study of religion. The reason is because there's no New Age movement per se. It's not like you can say, well, there's a Catholic Church and there's, different streams of Islam. You don't have New Age churches that people can go to. There's no centralized hierarchy, no, pervasive doctrine or membership. So although you can find certain themes that run within people you term New Age, be careful, that it's a very broad term. And sometimes people who would call themselves New Agers believe things that are different. But that definition from Wikipedia was pretty good. But there are two main doctrines that we can, assign to New Age that are common. And the one is what is called Evolutionary Godhood and global unity. So let's have a look at that. Okay, what is Evolutionary Godhood? So they accept, normal biological evolution. And so they believe, along with, evolutionary scientists, that, we are evolving, that we came from a more primitive primate, and man is getting more and more evolved. But they believe that the same principles can be applied to spirituality and God consciousness. And so man is actually getting progressively better and better and more enlightened spiritually. We're evolving. But just as in organic evolution, you've got the survival of the fittest. If you're familiar with Darwin's, theories, one of the, hallmarks of it is that the fact that you have the strong devouring the weak, and basically what survives and goes on to the next generation is determined by who's the strongest. They apply that same thing now to this spiritual evolution. And they say that all these wonderful things about moving into the age of Aquarius and about our evolving spiritually are understood by some who are the fittest. So that's generally them, the clever guys. Whereas the unfit, which is us stupid guys like Christians, and other proponents of dogmatic worldviews, we're actually a hindrance to evolutionary forces. It would be ideal if we were actually moved out of the way. That's why it would be nice if you had something like the rapture, which would remove all the Christians and sort of make it, a lot easier for these guys to get on with the job of going on to the next evolutionary jump. And then evolutionary godhood, is facilitated by practices which we would typically identify as occult related. And so I'll mention 4 of them. The one is astral projection, which is really occult, training your soul to leave your body and travel around, not necessarily practiced by all New Agers, bear in mind, but that's something, you'd expect someone who's involved in Wicca or, the occult to be doing, but people who call themselves New Age would also dabble in that. Channeling spirits so that they may speak through you or guide you. Unlike us who would say that that's demons they're messing around with, they obviously would appeal to the fact that it's actually angels or else spirit guides, You're trying to help. The use of crystals is something that's becoming very, very popular. And they supposedly purify the energy systems of your body and mind. Visualization techniques, which include everything from basic mental imagery to role-playing of animals and even divine creatures. Then moving on to the concept of global unity, bearing in mind that this is one of the things that we'd associate with someone who is really New Age. We have 3 parts. The one is man unified with man unified with nature, and man unified with God. Man unified with man. Obviously, this is very relevant to us as Christians because the belief is that ultimately mankind, because we're getting better and better and evolving, we're going to realize our proper divine relationship with one another, and there's going to be pure harmony, and with the relational harmony, because we're all a brotherhood of man, you're going to get economic unity. So, we won't want to cooperate and have, single currencies. And, with economic unity, you're going to want to have political unity, a single world government. I mean, why should we have different governments when we're all brothers? And then ultimately, spiritual unity, moving toward a one world religion. And you'd obviously recognize all of those as things, that we identify as things that are going to be hallmarks of the end times, and that if not directly stated are certainly implied by a lot of Bible prophecy. Then man unified with nature, the belief that God is everything and that everything is God. Therefore nature is also part of God. This is what we call pantheism. Okay, it's different to what would have been practiced by guys, the pagans like the Greeks and the Romans before Christianity. Remember, they had a pantheon of gods, but the gods were kind of like humans, except more powerful. Really just fallen angels or demons. But in this view in pantheism, everything is God, even if it's something that we would deem inanimate. Nature is part of God, and so we need to be in harmony with nature. Mankind is no different than any other animal, even though the Bible says that we're created in the image of God. We need to live in harmony with them and understand them and learn from them. And so many in the New Age movement will use this term Gaia, which refers to the union of earth and nature. And Gaia is revered and sometimes even worshipped as a god by some. American Indian rituals are also very popular in the New Age circles because they focus on the elements of nature and man's relationship to them. And then thirdly and finally, that man unified with God. So the belief that since man is divine by nature, all people can realize their divinity. So we can all be like Shirley MacLaine and declare to the world that you are God. Obviously, the definition of God's a bit different to, what we believe in, and monotheists believe in a creator God who's distinct from his creation. And, people can realize their divinity and contribute to the unified purpose of man, earth, and nature. Their goal in life is for each person to fully recognize their own divine goodness. Now, bear in mind that the New Age God, as I said, is not a personal God. It's an impersonal force. So kind of what you find in the Star Wars movies, if you're familiar with them, when they talk about the force be with you, and movement in the force is not something personal there. It's just this sort of impersonal life force. Well, that's pretty much a New Age concept. Remember who first told man you can be like God. We all know where that came from. So we know that all deception ultimately comes back to Satan. He gives it in different flavors because ultimately he realizes that different things appeal to different people. But he uses the same techniques. He found two things that worked well in Eden, and he's been using them ever since. What were his first two lies? He said, you can be like God and you will not die. You can be like God, the deity of man, and you find that in the New Age, and you find it in Eastern religion. And his other lie, you shall not die, that's reincarnation. Okay, and you find those beliefs again in New Age, Eastern religion. So he packages them a bit differently as to what he did in Eden, but ultimately he's still telling man the same thing, and man still foolishly believes the same lie. You shall not die, you will be like God. Now, relativism, this is something we find in a lot of these isms we've been looking at. Now, the New Age God, per se, if you want to call it God, has not revealed himself / itself / herself, to mankind, and therefore we're not accountable to any notions of moral law or absolute truth. So there's no objective morality in New Age philosophy. You need to have tolerance for all systems of truth, meaning and purpose. We should create a world of pure relativism, where morality and religion are strictly relative to each person's individual notion of reality herself. And this is from the Wikipedia article. Although New Age is generally tolerant, remember tolerance is the big thing, of almost any world religion or philosophy, it is opposed to the narrow-mindedness of Christianity that teaches Jesus Christ is the only way to eternal salvation. So that's what you normally find. You must be tolerant, except when it comes to Christians, in which case you mustn't be tolerant. Typical New Age ideals are religious pluralism. Remember, we defined pluralism previously. People are free to decide what they believe and how to use it in their lives. But it says in Proverbs 14 verse 12, there's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. The New Age says we're basically good and inherently divine. Romans 3:23 says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. No wonder they don't like Christians. New Age says we create our own reality. Romans 4 verse 17 says that only God calls into existence things that do not exist. There's some Christians who also go into that heresy as well, which is really Christian Science and New Age, that you can create your reality, and they kind of mix it up with biblical faith. But the Bible, says only God calls into existence the things that do not exist. When people tell me that they can create reality with their words and the power of words, and they try to confuse it with faith, I always ask them, when did you last create a planet? Or speak a world into existence? I look in the Bible, I only see God doing that kind of stuff. So if you want to impress me, show me a planet you created lately. Then moving on to liberalism. It's a political doctrine that, now remember, liberalism, again, you can apply it to multiple fields. You can apply it to politics, you can apply it to Christianity. I'm going to look at those two just very briefly. So in terms of politics, it's a very broad doctrine, but it takes protecting and enhancing the freedom of the individual to be the central problem of politics. Liberals typically believe that government is necessary to protect individuals from being harmed by others, which is true. That's a biblical viewpoint as well. That's why government was instituted by God after the flood, because of the anarchy that was pervasive before the flood, and how it ended in violence and only 8 people being, saved. But they also recognize that government itself can pose a threat to liberty. Now, liberalism is more of a political philosophy. They believe that spreading the wealth around is good for everybody. So in that sense, it's the same as socialism. However, it's a bit of a hypocritical socialism, because you'll find that often these liberals themselves are very wealthy. You don't see them standing in Central Park dishing out their money. And so I thought this was very appropriate. According to a Harvard Political Review, they say the difference between liberals and socialists can be seen by their different answers to the question, can the principles by which I vote differ from the principles by which I live? Liberals say yes, they can. Socialists say no. So a guy like Bill Gates probably will tell you he's a liberal. He's certainly not a socialist. So a liberal allows you to accept a salary that is 4, 10 or 100 times greater than that of the least well-off person in your society, so long as when you step into the voting booth, you don a new hat and act so that all inequalities are arranged to benefit the least well-off. So as I say, a bit of a hypocritical socialist. When we come to Christianity, generally we use liberalism as a dirty word. There are aspects of it which aren't bad, in fairness, but when it comes to the way they handle the scriptures, they are far too loose with scripture. And man's reason, and not the Bible, is treated as a final authority. They seek to reconcile Christianity with secular science and modern thinking. And so they treat science as all-knowing, and the Bible is full of fables, which are false. And so Genesis's early chapters are reduced to poetry or fantasy. They've got a message, but we shouldn't take them too literally, in spite of the fact that Jesus spoke of those chapters in literal terms. As we saw earlier, speaking of Adam and Eve as being literal people, and he spoke of Noah and Lot and all those people as real people. According to liberals, mankind is not totally depraved, and so they have an optimistic view of the future of mankind. The social gospel is also emphasized, and as I told you before, the social gospel is not necessarily always bad. There's nothing wrong with wanting to help people who are poor and welfare and all that. Those kind of aspects of it I've got no problem with. The inability of fallen man is to fulfill it is denied. Whether a person is saved from his sin and its penalty in hell is no longer the issue. The main thing is how we treat one another, and love of our fellow man becomes the defining issue. Once again, love is good, and the Bible tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves, so there's nothing wrong with that. But you can't take the gospel and forget about sin and the penalty of the sin and the fact that we need a redeemer. No matter how much you give to charity. And so as a result of that kind of reasoning, you find these kind of threads that will be taught or held by pseudo-Christians. I call it pseudo-Christians because I don't really believe that you can hold these views and really be a Christian. The idea is that the Bible is not God-breathed because it's got errors. Most of the authors of the Bible are not who they traditionally believe to be. The books were written many years later than claimed, so effectively they've been written by people who are frauds. And this is why, especially with the people doing the second year study, I tell them just to be careful, because if you take the liberal view, they will tell you that Matthew never wrote Matthew, Mark never wrote Mark, and Luke never wrote Luke. In fact, the only thing you know for certain is that whatever the book name is, it wasn't written by that person. It was written by someone pretending to be them many years later. So in other words, you've got someone who's really, a con artist. And yet supposedly we're supposed to use this, as our guide to life. As opposed to be the inspired word of God, they've all been written by people who are frauds. And they're basically attributing the books to someone else to give greater weight to their teachings. They don't believe that there's supernatural miracles. The virgin birth is a myth, for example. Jesus didn't rise again from the grave in bodily form. Well, according to Corinthians 15, if Christ is not risen, our faith is in vain. Remember? And we must become like the Epicureans and eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. According to them, hell is not real. Jesus was not God, he was a good moral teacher. The Bible is simply a good moral guide teaching us to love our neighbor. So instead of Jesus dying on the cross to redeem us because we're sinners, Jesus came and he just lived to be a good example to us. Okay, moving on to relativism. Okay, we're approaching the end. I think we've got about another 10-15 minutes to go. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, relativism is a family of philosophical views which deny claims to objectivity within a particular domain and asserts that facts in that domain are relative to the perspective of an observer or the context in which they are assessed. You see a lot of these things cropping up again and again. So in truth relativism, there's no absolute truths because it's always relative to some frame of reference, such as a language or culture. Ethical relativism says that truth is variable. What constitutes right and wrong is determined solely by the individual or by society. And because of that, you've got no right to judge someone else from another society because that's just your society's opinion or your own personal opinion. So who are you to judge anyone else? If it comes to cultural relativism, they say that since there's no universal standard of morality, you don't have the right to judge another society's customs. You know, so if you go to a society where they think it's okay to eat people after they've beaten them in battle, and you know, cannibalism and those sort of things, that's okay. And so cultural relativism is widely accepted in modern anthropology. They believe that all cultures are worthy in their own right and are of equal value. And so typically they don't like missionaries because they believe that missionaries are going and destroying all these wonderful cultures. Okay, when the gospel penetrates hearts and changes lives, some cultural change will always follow. But to me, if a person's a cannibal and you go evangelize them and they stop being a cannibal, I would think that that's a pretty good thing to do. Okay, these obviously, those who take it to the extreme, would say that if you were to do that, exactly the example I used, you know, and they cease in this cultural practice of cannibalism, you're accused of cultural imperialism. And so today's anthropologist says that all cultures are equally legitimate expressions of human existence. We shouldn't go as missionaries and destroy all these cultures. Now I want to tell you, to put it in perspective, there has been a mistake of some missionaries to confuse converting a person to westernizing them. In order to convert someone, they don't have to dress like a Westerner. They don't have to like the kind of music we listen to. We need to realize that there's people in different cultures and they don't have to like Western, you know, dress and music in order to be a Christian. And it's a mistake that has been made. It was a mistake that was identified by guys like Hudson Taylor, and that's why he was so effective among the Chinese, for example, because he would don the dress of the Chinese, he would cut his hair like the Chinese, he learned to speak their language. And that's good because he was taking the things of their culture that weren't sinful, and that was his attitude. If there's something in a culture that's not sinful, there's no harm in adopting it in order to win people, which is exactly the same thing as what Paul did when he said, I become all things to all men. He was talking about the fact that to the Gentiles, when he went to the Gentiles, he came not trying to push Jewish culture on them and trying to circumcise them and make them speak Hebrew. And you know, he spoke to them in their language, he wrote to them in their language, and they made sure that the gospel was presented in its entirety, but, you know, to the Gentiles, not removing the essential gospel. Now, that's something we've got to recognize. But if there are aspects of a culture which are sinful, in the extreme example I used of cannibalism, but there might be polygamy allowed in the society, and there might be slavery, there might be idolatry. We can't say that people can carry on that sort of thing and still be a Christian. So if a person wants to become a Christian and you're a missionary in that society, doesn't matter if it's part of the culture, those sort of things will naturally go when people come under the sound of the gospel. But when it comes to amoral issues, missionaries should seek to preserve and honor the culture of the people they serve. And to be fair, that has been the approach of the more successful missionaries like the Amy Carmichaels, who, adopted the cultural, practices of the Indians in order to be effective there without adopting their pagan, beliefs, and effectively kicked against them and, went and kidnapped girls who were being taken as prostitutes into, their temples in order to free them. Yet when we call another group like Islamic extremists evil, cultural relativists will be horrified. They call us Islamophobic. I love this phobic. Phobic means you're afraid of them. So we're afraid of people who are homosexuals. And, it's funny you don't get a Christianophobic person. But we should be trying to understand radical Islam rather than to fight it as something that's evil. The cultural relativist believes that Westerners should not impose their ideas on terrorists, including the idea that the suicide bombing of civilians is evil. Can you believe it? Islamic belief in the necessity of jihad is just as valid as any belief in Western civilization, they assert. And America is as much to blame for the attacks of 9/11 as are the terrorists. Okay, this is the last section. Woke. It's the second last section. I must say, when I saw this, I'd never heard of it. I asked my daughter about it. She knows about it and was saying that I think Katy Perry claims to, conform to this, and apparently it's quite well known to the in crowd. So I'm showing my age here. But it's a term that originated in the US, which refers to a perceived awareness of issues. And again, you're going to see a lot of the things cropping up again: social justice, racial justice. It derives from the African American vernacular English expression "stay woke." It's bad English, really, but that's where it came from. Referring to a continuing awareness of these issues. In other words, they're talking about being awake or vigilant in a social sense. By the late 2010s, it had been adopted as a more generic slang, broadly associated with left-wing politics, social justice movement, and socially liberal causes like LGBT rights and feminism, and more recently been associated with the Black Lives Matter movement. The English philosopher, now this is obviously before the advent of stuff like this, but I like what he said, because to me it kind of encapsulates a lot of these things that we've been, discussing. He said, the specific mark of the modern world is not that it is skeptical, but that it is dogmatic without knowing it. It says in mockery of old devotees that they believed without knowing why they believed. But the moderns believe without knowing what they believe, and without even knowing that they do believe it. Their freedom consists in first freely assuming a creed and then freely forgetting that they are assuming it. I thought that was a wonderful description of our modern world. Dani Goosen, who's a professor, as you can see by his name, South Africa, of religious studies at UNISA, writes of woke. At its core, it is fueled by the desire to do away with the Western world and its cultural heritage. Groups like Black Lives Matter act as the stormtroopers of the academic, media, political and business elites. The way cities in the US and other countries are looted and turned into chaos is handled by these elites with velvet gloves. Statues are destroyed and buildings representing the status quo are burned. People armed with guns and protected by armed guards who destroy property, including burning down buildings, and they claim to be protesting. The former president of Cornerstone University in Michigan, Dr. Rex M. Rogers, writes, "If you think woke culture or wokeism, with its attendant cancel culture, isn't going to bother Christians, the church, Christianity, or Christ himself, you should think again. Woke people often consider themselves, or at least those they purport to represent, victims. Consequently, they seem to be offended by nearly everything. That is bad enough, but the real problem begins with their penchant for wanting to silence or cancel everything and everyone with which or with whom they disagree, turning them into bullies. And we know that bullies are never satisfied and they're never placated. So if as a Christian you're going to try to placate these guys, you're not going to succeed, because no amount of agreement, apology, acquiescence or appeasement is enough. Bullies always demand more. Now it is burning Bibles and the American flag, attacking churches, Christianity, even Christ. Black Lives Matter activists vandalized churches. Bibles will not be the last of this. Now we have a book claiming that Christianity is at the bottom of racism and was shaped by white supremacy. Sorry, Christianity at the bottom is about racism. And again, to quote G.K. Chesterton, remembering that he wrote a long time ago, I like what he said here, "It is a parable of you and all your rationalists. You begin by breaking up the cross, but you end by breaking up the habitable world." So what is the Christian response? Well, we are told by Peter that we need to be able to give an answer for the hope that we have within us. So we need to be informed about these issues. Don't put our heads in the sand. At least now we know what they mean. Okay? Be able to apply your Christian worldview to these issues. Be humble in speaking the truth in love with gentleness and respect. Be forgiving as Christ forgave us. Be aware that suffering, harassment, possibly persecution could come your way for what you believe. Be confident in the Lord, for He is sovereign. Okay, so finally, we get to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This one's not too long. This is actually more associated with psychology. I studied this when I studied a bit of psychology. And so, effectively, you have this 5-tier model of human needs. What Maslow said is that humans are motivated to achieve certain needs, but some are more important than others. And so our most basic need, he said, is at the bottom there, physiological, for survival. And that's the first thing that motivates our behavior, our desire to survive. And once we've satisfied that, safety is the next. And, basic needs would also include not only food, water, but also things like sleep and sex. Safety needs, which is on the next level, is security, order, and stability. So our desire to have shelter and safety. Once you've got that, those are your very sort of basic needs. You then will be looking for love and for belonging. And you can see there's a bit of truth in this, and I know that the notes try to advocate that as Christians we use it. I disagree, by the way, even though it might seem to have a bit of truth in it. Love and belonging, so where we want, to effectively be loved by family and friends and to belong. And then the fourth level, which you'd move on to, is once you have all of those, is esteem, where we want to be competent and recognized, and to have people award us some level of status due to the success that we've had. And then the final one, that when you've got all of those, and this is the highest level that you can aspire to, is what Maslow called self-actualization, where this individual has got all these other things, and so then they aspire to focus on themselves and try to build their own image. And they may look at this in terms of feelings such as self-confidence or by accomplishing a set goal. Now, this is what we call humanist psychology. It's very different, I must say, from early psychology. The early psychology was a lot more pessimistic about man. In fact, Sigmund Freud, saw man just really as a highly evolved animal. In his mind, all men really wanted to kill their father and sleep with their mother. And I'm not even exaggerating. That's what's called the Oedipus complex. We're just a highly evolved animal, and just as you got the alpha male who wants to take over in the wolf pack, so apparently men really want to kill their father and replace them and sleep with their mother. According to him, apparently that's what he wanted to do. Skinner, on the left there, also had his behavioral psychology. We also just saw us as animals. In fact, he got all his theories from torturing rats. So there we have a theory of psychology, behavioral psychology, where, they made rats do certain things when they rewarded them, and when they did bad things, they shocked them. So it was formulated on, tormenting rats. But Maslow, thought that Freudian psychologists placed too much emphasis on human weaknesses, and he developed what he called positive psychology. Now, let me tell you, Freud and Skinner were both atheists. And what has influenced a lot of what is called Christian psychology or Christian counseling is not really Freud and Skinner. I think those are so obviously anti-Christian. But a lot of Christian psychology is influenced by Maslow. What they don't realize is Maslow was also an atheist. And he believed that all religions are in essence the same. He said spiritual, ethical and moral values have nothing to do with any church. They are the common core of all churches and religions, including the non-theistic ones. In other words, the ones without God. But the Bible tells me, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly. I don't believe as Christians we should be going to people for counsel who base their ideas on these sort of systems that have been built up on human wisdom. So human beings, Maslow believed, need something bigger than themselves, that they need to be connected to, but not in a religious sense. So he was an atheist, but he spoke of God in a more philosophical term, as beauty, truth, and goodness. So just our need to have something bigger than ourselves. Now, he is best known for that hierarchy of needs. He believed that once all those needs are met, we'd have a perfect society, a utopia. And that comes from the idea that man is intrinsically good. And this is why you get this nonsense coming through in Christian counseling, where basically our biggest problem is that we don't have enough self-esteem. That's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches original sin and human depravity. There's no one righteous, not even one. There's no one who understands. There's no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They've together become worthless. There's no one who does good, not even one. Now, my problem with this, because as I say, at the surface it looks good, and I know that our notes are even saying we should try and use it. If you look at that, what is at the bottom there? Our basic needs, that's what to eat, what shall I wear. Jesus said there was something more important than that, and I don't see it on that pyramid. He said, don't say, what shall I eat, what shall I wear? He said, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all those things will be given to you as well. According to Jesus, we seek his kingdom and his righteousness, and those things fall into place. According to Maslow, you start at the physiological level, safety, and you build yourself up. Man does it. You're innately good. According to Jesus, you shouldn't be running after even those basic things. In fact, you should seek the kingdom of God, and God will take care of the rest. Other problem that I have with it is that top one, self-actualization and even esteem. It says those who are self-seeking, for those who are self-seeking, there'll be wrath and anger. The Bible doesn't tell us to self-actualize. It doesn't teach self-esteem. It teaches us to love God and to love our neighbors. And so Paul speaks about people in the last days being preoccupied with a positive self-image, and we've seen this coming to the church. We are told in 2 Timothy 3 that in the last days people will be lovers of themselves. People's problem is not lack of self-esteem. Their problem is that they love themselves too much. Boastful, proud, conceited. And yet there are many Christian leaders who promote that self-love that Paul warned would characterize men in the last days. And that's because of this humanist psychology. As I say, it's not the Freudian psychology, it's not the behavioral stuff, it's the humanistic stuff, because it's more deceptive, and that's crept into psychology, Christian psychology. And so this is a Christian psychologist. He says, our attitude towards ourselves, our self-concept, or our self-image is one of the most important things we possess. Our self-concept is the source of our personal happiness or lack of it. Now, I thought it was seeking God's kingdom and His righteousness. It establishes the boundaries of our accomplishment and defines the limits of our fulfillment. If we think little of ourselves, we either accomplish little or drive ourselves unmercifully to disapprove our negative self-evaluation. If we think positively about ourselves, we are free to achieve our true potential. That's great. If you're a psychologist and you like Maslow, it's got nothing to do with Christianity. It's not found in historical Christianity. Self-esteem, self-image, self-worth, and self-love are not concepts promoted in the Bible. They're drawn from self-image psychology based on atheistic, humanistic psychology. Okay, and it comes from guys like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, who, albeit nicer guys than Skinner and Freud and Jung, they still have something that's far more deceptive. And so C.S. Lewis says that we should have a modest opinion of ourselves. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Romans 12 verse 3 says, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the measure of faith God has given you. Final slide. The Bible doesn't teach self-love. It doesn't teach that you need more self-esteem. It doesn't tell you that God wants you to be successful. He wants you to fulfill your dreams and reach your full potential. It teaches self-denial. Your dream has been crucified. Jesus said in Matthew 16 verse 24, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. That doesn't correlate to me with with the top levels of that pyramid of Maslow. It's not self-actualization and esteem that we're looking for at the end. Jesus is talking about self-denial, and he talks in the beginning about seeking first God's kingdom. God looks after the other stuff, and then ultimately it leads to a point where we have self-denial. So I don't believe it's of any use to Christians.